Hi, I'm Kate Wiley. I'm the Education Programs Director for Beacon House. And I'm here with Emo. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Emo. I'm one of the parents. I'm a mother of two kids, 3 years old and 5 year old, and originally from Ethiopia. Moved to this country 10 years ago and really took it in. And I'm a nurse. I'm a registered nurse working for Kaiser program.
I'm Maria Russo. I'm the children's books editor at the New York Times Book Review. I am the co-author of How to Raise a Reader, and I'm here with my co-author.
Hi, I'm Pamela Paul, co-author with Maria of How to Raise a Reader and editor of the New York Times Book Review. Very excited to talk to all of you.
Exciting.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you for inviting us.
Do you want to start?
I can start. Yeah, so first of all, thank you for giving me this chance, Keisha, and I'm so excited to meet the owners of How to Raise a Reader on time. I was struggling a lot because of different cultural from where I was born and grew up, and I had a lot of questions in my brain, and this thing comes back to me like on time. And I would like to say thank you, ladies, for writing this book. This book is going to be my reference all lifelong for my kids. I just read it one time, but it's going to be next to my bed every day while through the process of taking care of my kids. I really want to say thank you. You guys did a good job.
Oh,
Yeah,
I'm so happy.
That makes us so happy. That's why we wrote it.
Yeah. So the first question that's been going on in my brain as an immigrant mother coming from different culture is, as an author for children's book, what do you guys have like advice regarding how to raise kids in this country coming from completely different country and different culture, different resource? So I've been asking all parents whenever I make like take one, the library, or wherever I go. So this is a good opportunity for me to hear from you guys in person, and like not only from me. And I know there are a lot of immigrants in this country, so it would have been like it's going to be a good chance for them to get this answer or advice from you guys.
Well, I can start with that one. It's a great moment to be raising a child with a diverse background in this country because the publishing industry has really responded to calls for more diverse books. There's a whole group called We Need Diverse Books that pushed for change, and the change is happening. So there's lots of books out there right now that reflect children from all different backgrounds, all different kinds of living situations. It's so important. It's really the most important thing for children's reading, that they see themselves in their books. You know, the phrase that has become really popular is windows and mirrors, which was coined by an educator named Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop. I'm sure you've heard that phrase, and it's her idea is basically that children need books that are windows that give them a view of other people's lives and other cultures, but they also need books that are mirrors that mirror back to them their life and their family and how they live. And you can find those books now. You can look in the library, you can look on every bookstore. The kids in your child's classroom will probably have books that have protagonists that look like your child, and you need to make sure that you give your child those books and give them a really wide array of options for their reading so that they do see, oh, my heritage is something to be proud of. Oh, there's my grandma in that book. That's so important. It's something everyone can do now. I think there's I can't think of any background that I haven't seen at least one good children's book recently, and that's really exciting.
Yeah, I think one of the other things that that we emphasize throughout the book is that basically everything about raising a reader has to do with the parent as well. This is not just about your child doing something in isolation, but it's about the parent and the child reading together and having a family culture of reading together. And so it's also an opportunity for the parent to get a window into, into American culture through the books that their children read. For many parents coming from other countries, especially when English isn't their first language, like a lot of American culture is a mystery, and you have no idea, like how does a classroom operate? What is my relationship supposed to be with the classroom teacher? Like, do they never want to hear from me? How do things, work with friends and play dates? And a lot of that is reflected in the books that your child will be reading. So I think it's a great opportunity when a parent is reading the book together with their child, that it's a learning experience for both the parent and the child.
Yeah, I like what you say. Like, you say the right thing. Is like my worry and my concern is like what advice we give as a parents. Because if I give you like the summary of my life in short, like 2 minutes, I came from the country which I don't even have none of the book, like not children book. I didn't read anything. The only thing I know is, of course, I went to school for nursing. I know about nursing, I want education. But being a child and raised in that country, we don't have that kind of opportunity. Like, I don't even know if I have to read a book for the child. And I don't even know if I have to take my child early to the library. Like, I did because I was looking for it. I was searching because I got this chance because I'm a nurse. I made a lot of friends, co-workers at work. That out there are a lot of mothers and fathers. They don't know anything. They don't even know why you take your child to the library. They question you all the time.
Right.
So as a community or as an older, is there anything we can help them like to do? You have to do
But
this.
you mean your fellow parents?
Fellow
You
parents.
can just spread the word, and spread the word
Yeah.
also that reading is fun,
Yeah.
right? Here we are at RIF.
Yeah.
I remember my whole childhood that reading is fundamental.
Yeah.
That reading is something that doesn't only take place in school. Reading also can take place in your home, and guess what? Kids love it.
Yeah.
It's a way that your kids are going to enjoy themselves and find a little bit of escape from some of the pressures of school. So I would encourage your community members and your friends to make sure their kids are reading for fun, not just for school.
I also have to say that as a parent myself, personally, I wasn't always eager to be on the floor playing with my kids. I wasn't necessarily interested in their toys, but reading with my child was always a hugely pleasurable
It's
experience.
really
You
a
have your
great
child
part
in
of
your
being
lap,
a parent.
right?
It's
And you're
the
like
best
sitting
memories when
there.
they're
Yeah,
gone
it's for me, I
are
love
going to
it.
be the memories of
Yeah.
reading with your child.
It's that physical proximity.
Yeah.
And so I think
And
that
just share that with friends who might
that's what we
try
have
it.
to do.
And I will say, both of my parents are first generation immigrant from Italian American families, and they're big readers, and I'm obviously a big reader, and it doesn't really take long for this to just kind of catch on and become part of a family culture. I remember one moment when my father, who reads more than anyone I know, was reading to one of my kids, and afterwards he said, the saddest thing I ever heard was like, no one ever read to me when I was a kid.
Yeah.
It was so heartbreaking to me, but then I was like, well, but now he's a grandpa reading to his grandchildren, so it doesn't really take long for these generational changes to take place in a family.
Yeah, I have to say I wasn't really read to as a child either, so it was just sort of something that was
The
considered to be
generation have
the
a
kid's
difference.
job, So I think that's one of the most important points, is that it's really easy to conceive of raising a reader if you're a huge reader. It's not necessarily as easy if you weren't raised reading yourself, or it's just not a habit for you, because it's really then about changing two people's behavior, your behavior and your child's behavior, and creating these new habits and kind of establishing a new family culture that you might not have grown up with yourself.
One of the things that you say in the book is, one of the suggestions to parents is that to allow a later bedtime if they're going to read. So it says something like, if your child's bedtime is normally 7, allow them to choose whether or not they want to read till 7:30 or like 7, and I love that because I get a lot of kids who don't think that reading is fun or a privilege, and I think a lot of times it's used somewhat as a punishment. Like you can you need 5 minutes out, you may read or not, but that becomes part of the mindset. So I loved that suggestion. I actually gave it to our parents at our parent orientation the other night, because it's one way to like make sure that it's really a privilege and a choice.
Yeah, I have to say that came from personal experience, because that's what I did with my 3 kids, where it was basically like, your bedtime is 7, but if you want to read, you can stay up until 7:30.
Yeah.
So it totally places the decision making in their own hands.
Right.
And then every
Another
kid,
thing
who
you
doesn't
don't
want to
do.
stay up late? I
Right.
mean, you know, so like if you can stay up late reading, like
Yeah.
that's great. And it's interesting because for me, like I would be like hiding, like with my flashlight under the blankets, like because I didn't grow up with that
Yeah.
kind of thing. But I felt like a little bit like, ooh, I'm breaking the rules, and I'm reading under the. So in a weird way, that can work too. But I think it's much better if it's actually the parent that's sort of showing them, and then the kids, if you have more than one child too, it's like you feel like a bigger kid if you're allowed to stay
Right.
late.
And you were talking earlier about diversity, and I have our population in our community is 95% African American, 5% Hispanic, and so as I was looking through your book list, which are great and very helpful, I just was sort of wondering if you have a book list of books that feature those two populations, and I know that you say in here. Page 35 talks about the ALA Association as the sort of gold standard, and you talk about Cornelius King and a couple of other people that you featured that honor the best African American Latino nonfiction books. But I was wondering if you have an actual list or a website that you would suggest.
Well, we
Or
sort of
do the
sprinkled
site
those in all the other lists. We didn't make separate lists by ethnicity, but there's tons of websites you could find with great lists. And we often, on the New York Times books websites, I do lots of children's book roundups, and there'll be often African American themed books, but just an exclusively African American list. Definitely the Coretta Scott King Award. If you go back over the years, those are fantastic choices, and they go from picture book to right through YA, and you can get and there's the medal winner every year, and then honor winners, and those are a great way to get sort of the very best chosen African American books. But it's a very, very strong tradition, African American children's books, and just getting stronger. Every year there's just more and more being published. When I started in this job 5 years ago, very few, the numbers were crazy.
Yeah.
Almost every child you would see would be a white child in a picture book,
Right.
for example.
Yeah.
And that's really changing every month. I see new books coming in with a lot of African American children, a lot of Asian children, Latino children. I'm excited about Native American books that are starting to really become more numerous and excellent. And
I mean, one of the big changes that has happened in the last 5 years as well is that not only are there a lot of books that are very specifically about the African American or Latino experiences, but that every single picture book now that's being written is very cognizant of diversity.
Yeah.
So back in the day, when The Snowy Day came out by Ezra Jack Keats, it was very notable because it was not about race, it was not race specific, and yet it featured an African American boy in an everyday situation that everyone could relate to. Right now, if you are a children's book publisher or a children's book author or illustrator, you are very conscious of the fact that if you have more than one child, especially in any picture book, you cannot have all white kids, and so everyone is making sure that any depiction of children is, reflects the
society
population
we're living in.
Yeah. So I think that's very positive, because I think it used to be that there were certain authors and illustrators. There was James Ransom. There was Jerry Pinkney. There were a bunch of wonderful Jacqueline Woodson. Children's book authors who would who would write specifically for that population, but that was kind of it, and then everything else would be white, and that's changed a lot.
I think we might, at the community center, we have a library, but it's very outdated. So I think I'm trying to update it through RIF, and looking for some titles, because I want to be really conscious of that when I'm choosing book titles, not just the ones that I read as a kid, which tend to feature an all-white cast.
It's really important to make sure that when kids go into a library or go into any selection of books, they see themselves.
Yeah.
So if you're
I mean, it used to be the only way to really get at that for kids who were not white was through books about animals, where the animals were the characters, so that it wasn't race specific. But it has gotten better, and it's one of the hard things about children's books is that parents, when they're going to buy children's books for their kids or take them out from the library, they reach for the ones that they grew up with.
Right.
And the ones that we grew up with were, you know, Richard Scarry, and they were Blueberries for Sal, and they were all white kids.
Yeah.
And they were also very sexist. When I go back and read the books from my childhood, I cannot believe the limitations on what the girl characters do and what the moms do. So that's another reason I really think it's important for libraries and personal collections to refresh themselves with the great new books that are being published that reflect more of how the world is now that these kids are growing up in. You have another?
Yeah, another
question for
question.
us?
A lot. Bunch of So the other question I have is like, as a you're a mother, so like as a mother or as an older, how do you manage like reading books for if you have like more than one child with different ages? Like for me, I have like 3-year-old and 5-year-old now. When I read, like I just come up with my own idea. I say, okay, let me start with the little one with the picture book, and then whatever I think that's good for her.
Yeah.
So what do you suggest, like?
I mean, one thing that I think is great about children's books is it surprised me. I have 3 kids. Maria has 3 kids. My kids now are 14, 12, and 10, so they're not gathered on my lap anymore reading books with me. But even when they were, what was funny is when I started reading a book for the 3-year-old, say when the 5-year-old was in the room, he would often come around and want to listen in because he remembered that book, you know, and kids really enjoy sort of going back and appreciating the books that they liked when they were little. And what's nice is that if it is the book that your 5-year-old liked, he probably remembers it, and then he can read it aloud a little bit, read it, even if he's not reading, he might have memorized some of it. So you can do kind of fun games where you bring in the older child and you say, like, why don't you read this page? You know, I'll read the left page, you read the right page, we'll read it to your 3-year-old little sister or something like that.
But you know, I also think in my mind, the greatest picture books are for every age. You're lucky that you have 2 kids still in the picture book stage, because I mean the official age for picture books is 4 to 8, right? So both your kids are straight in that range. So the really good picture books, I think, really should speak to both of your kids. And I think it might just take a little trial and error to find those books. You know, I can see some right here. You know, like this one is a great idea. You know, this book I think would work for a 3-year-old. It would work for a 5-year-old. You know, especially right about this time of year when they're both about to start school. You know, this is a great book for someone a little bit scared to start at the new place. You know, and maybe the 3-year-old will take something slightly different, but don't be afraid to read your 3-year-old books where the language is a little more advanced. They like to hear the cadences. They're getting the idea, and they have the pictures. The illustrations are telling the story.
I mean, it's an interesting thing that takes place with children that you've probably experienced yourself, and I'm sure you know about, which is that at a certain age, I think it's around 5 or 6, kids will start to ask, what does that word mean? But before that, they just take it for whatever it is. They just absorb it. And so I didn't hesitate to read something a little bit old for the younger child because they're getting it at some level. And with a picture book, one of the things that we forget as parents, because we're so focused on the words, is that there's a whole other story going on with the pictures. And so the 5-year-old might be sort of looking at the words and trying to figure it out. And the 3-year-old might be reading some pictures. And they are also probably reading both the pictures and the words at different levels because there are different levels, you know, cognitively and developmentally. So I agree with Maria, like you can have the same book that kids at different ages can just enjoy in different ways.
Right, and then don't forget a picture book, the words and the pictures are equals. They're both working together to tell the stories. It's not just that the illustrator is illustrating what happens in the words. The illustrator too is using storytelling techniques that are visual, and it's really important for your 3-year-old to be following that story through the pictures. And they'll always throw in a few little extra details that are not in the words.
Yes, yeah.
Because the illustrator, if there's a separate illustrator and author especially, they want to make sure they are telling their story too.
Yeah.
So see if your kid can pick out stuff that maybe isn't even
they
in the
do
words.
that. Like, I saw you guys that wrote something about the picture. I didn't realize, I was telling Keisha the other day, I didn't realize that my son was reading, like, known all the pictures on the book.
Yeah.
He knows more than I knew about the
Yes.
pictures. So I'm trying to just give an idea that am I in the right track, because now he's turning 5, she's 3. She is a girl. She's like going up, like she's going faster than him. I know I can do that.
That
But
happens.
I'm like, when I read, he said, "Oh, mommy, we got this list." She want to focus on the picture, and then after I read this book, okay, this is the time for her to explore this book. And then I
Yeah.
gave them like, today we're gonna start with your book, and tomorrow with on analysis.
Right.
Trying
That's
to
a-
give
that's
them,
a
just
good-
coming up with my own solution for that. Otherwise, they're not that bad. Like they're not older, 2 years apart. And then the book, I'm lucky one. Like our library in Montgomery County, like before I had hard time. Like I go to library, I start reading to them since they were born. I'm lucky. Like I have a good neighbors. They advise me.
Fantastic.
So before I was having hard time when I go to library, I just pick like which one I have to pick with my first child. So Montgomery County Library, they came up with this. They say sign up for 1,000 book before kindergarten. So they will give you the list. I love it because when I go to library, I just pick like every week I pick like 40, 50 books in addition to whatever they need later. Now they know. I say pick whatever book you want, and then I pick that one. So that is why I say, am I doing the right way? Because
It
I don't
sounds
want
like
to
you're
like
doing an
compromise.
amazing
Yeah,
job
I
of
don't
just
want-
exposing it to lots of different
Yeah,
books
I've
and
been
trial
taking him
and
since
error,
he was
finding
7
what they
months
like.
old to the library.
That's amazing. That's you're doing
One
it
of the-
just right.
One of the great secrets, I think, of children's books that a lot of people aren't aware of necessarily are wordless picture books, because wordless picture books enable anyone to tell the story, right? And so it's also a great thing for people for whom English isn't their first language, or they might not feel like totally fluent readers themselves. If you have a wordless book, like you have Goodnight Gorilla, for example, do you know that book? It's a great bedtime book, and it's
Well, there's 2
essentially-
words in it.
There's 2 words in it.
I
Yes,
know.
yes. But it's a great book because you can read it 100
Right.
times, different every time. The 5-year-old can tell the story. The 3-year-old can tell
Yeah,
the story.
they
The
do
parent
that.
can tell
Yeah.
the
There's
story.
one of them.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah. So I
And
think
then me myself, honestly, like you said, I learned a lot. Like even if I went to school in English back home, when I moved to this country 10 years ago, I can communicate a little bit, but I learned a lot.
Oh
Even
yeah,
for
it's
them, I learned.
incredible.
In the past 5 years, I learned a lot about this country.
And don't forget, as
And
they
a
get
lot of
older,
kids
remember the
forget.
Jeopardy champion recently that said his secret to studying was by reading children's books, because children's authors have to make the information clear
Yeah.
and brief and accessible,
It is.
and the information has to be right.
It's a lot. In one
So
page, I
it's
don't even
just a
see
great,
what the-
great way to learn. I learn picture book biographies right now. There's so many biographies. I've learned so much about these amazing lives of the less famous, influential people that we didn't know about. You get a 32-page picture book biography and you learn their life story. It's amazing.
I think when we were growing up, especially as a girl, it's gotten so much better. But it used to be that you would have the nurses, Clara Barton and Florence Nightingale, and then the first ladies, Abigail Adams, and like maybe Helen Keller, but like then
And
no
Amelia
one else.
Earhart,
And then,
and
yeah,
that was it.
that was
Right?
it.
And now it's just, there's so many to choose from.
Yeah, and a lot of
so-
diversity in there as well, which I think is to your point earlier. I want to say one other thing about wordless picture books, which is that it's a great lesson in, as a parent, in remembering that the story is told through the pictures as much as it is through the words. That I've had that experience with when my kids were little, of reading a book to them, and they'd be laughing, and they'd be like, "But it's not funny," and they're like, "Yeah, but over here, like this is happening, and it's really funny." And then that's when it really sort of hits home that they're reading a different story from you in a way.
In the book, you talk about you describe the rules for home and school differently in terms of supporting readers. I run after school and summer programs, so we don't fall in either of those categories necessarily. So how do you describe, where would we fit in terms of home or school, or what would you suggest? Because as you describe them, they're very, very different
Yeah.
in a way, and so I'm
Yeah.
just curious.
I mean, I think that's a great opportunity to create a space that's not home and not school, but is a place where books are fun and books are approached as entertainment and personal discovery, right? I mean, the idea is that kids benefit from being exposed to reading in an environment that's not pressurized, where they're not feeling judged. They're not going to feel bad about themselves. They don't feel pushed by the adults to be, yet another piece of homework. Right, so if you can, in your after-school program, create an environment where books are a really fun way to spend some time after school, and are even kind of, this cool thing to trade, like swapping books. Did you get the new Dogman yet? Or how many have you read in, the Warrior series? Or, kids love series. They love collecting books.
You can do things that, I think one of the main points of the book is that at school, that's where you learn how to read. That's where kids learn how to read. And at home, it's where they learn to love to read. And the point that you made earlier about the raising the bedtime, you can kind of figure out a way of doing that in an after-school program, right? So you can make it very special by saying, let's say, having a corner of the room where it's the reading nook, and there's only 5 kids allowed there at a time. Sorry, because that's just a very quiet reading area. We don't want it to get too crowded. And there are nice pillows and stuffed animals and really welcoming shelves, but only 5 kids in at a time. I know it sounds kind of manipulative, but it sort of creates this atmosphere of reading as something really special. Yeah. And a lot of programs and classrooms and will sort of do the same thing with technology, but not think about doing it with kids. Only 5 kids on the iPads, at a time. Yeah. Why don't we do that with books as well?
That makes sense. I try to create reading corners that are the most attractive corner for space in the room, because with comfortable things like beanbag chairs and rugs
and I think all of us have to be.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, you can even do things everybody gets to pick an animal when they're reading their book, and you have these great stuffed animals, and you get to sort of sit with your stuffed animal and read a book, and it just sort of ways in which you create a kind of a sense that this is a special and that it's a privilege and that it's a fun thing.
And also, I think that the de-emphasizing of the level of the reading, I think it's really important for your staff to not be asking, what is that book too easy for you, or what's your reading level now? There's a lot of emphasis on that in the school already, and maybe your staff could be more focused on, who's your favorite author again, or wow, how many books have you read in the Geronimo Stilton series? Maybe training them to ask that kind of question about enthusiasm and interest, and less focused on what level you're at.
Yeah.
Because they already know, and they're getting it at school. They don't need to hear about their reading level again, when they're with you.
Yeah. The other thing I would say, and this might sound antithetical to or counterintuitive, but you can have comic books in there and Minecraft books, and that's great because I think that kids are getting a lot of institutional reading at school, and I think that if you want to emphasize that books are fun and that books are something where you get to choose, you get to choose your own adventure, you get to choose what world you want to enter, you want to make sure that you have, as Maria said, totally non-judgmental, pressure-free array of books that will appeal to kids. And look, if it's things that you might not necessarily be a fan of, superheroes or whatever it might be, it's reading. So it's great that kids are doing it no matter what the subject.
I saw, so I think that's great, maybe a little bit ideal, just because we have a lot of our grants are asking about how many hours are you reading. We had to do the summer pre and post tests, for literacy, and so it is becoming a little bit pressurized, which is unfortunate for me because I love reading books with kids. My mom's a librarian, so I grew up reading all the time. But one of the things that I enjoyed seeing that was sort of a little bit out of the box was we went to the National Mall. We went to the Natural History Museum, and one of the volunteers was with a group of our kids, and she made it sort of a contest of who wants to read this box about that animal and that box. And I just thought that was so cool. And that for them, they were they really wanted to be the one to read that box, this box about that, the cool looking jellyfish or whatever it was. So I thought that was really cool. And I am trying to create the literacy corners. It's just, we are also getting pressure to read in a conventional way. So just trying to find.
But how old are the kids in your program?
K to 12, but the ones that I think about the most are the K to 6.
Yeah. Another thing too is to do reading buddies. If you have a range, which is great, right? So then it's a privilege to be selected as like, you know what, you're like, you read that so beautifully. And again, not emphasis on like good or well, but you're such a good expressive reader. You know, you're such a funny reader, like, or you pick great books. Why not, you could get to be one of our, you know, reading buddies. And again, it's like, it's a kind of mark of honor, and then it also creates the connections between the kids.
Yeah.
And I wonder too, like, do you, because you're under that pressure, is there a way to not convey it to the kids? Do you know what I mean? Like, there's just subtle shifts in how, in your language, that the kids, that will make, I think, a big difference in, you know, they don't have to know that, you know, that they're being, that you're writing down what level they're on. You can, when you talk about the book, it's just, you know, this is a great graphic novel that you would like, not what level it is.
I mean, another thing to remember is that reading, kids will get better with reading just by practice, right? And so it doesn't matter if they're reading something that's below level, right? But they're reading 20 of them, then that's practice. And like, and eventually they'll stop wanting to read like Rainbow Fairies or whatever the endless series might be, and to go up to something that's more of their level. So I think that, you know, not emphasizing those levels so much as making sure that it stays something voluntary and enjoyable. Like, they'll get there eventually.
So one of my questions, actually, you mentioned about superheroes. Like, do you have any like recommendation what age? Because when I have a superhero books, because my son came up one day, Mommy, can I have superhero book? I was like, he was 3. I said, okay. I don't know what superhero, whatever it is, I don't know up here. So even for my brain, it's too hard to understand. I was like, I got off from it, and then I just kept it, and then since I get this chance, do you guys have like recommendation what age we have to like read it to them, or do we still have to stay away from them? I just let him to have like shirt or shoes of like Spider-Man, and my daughter wants, now she learned from him, I want Mommy Wonder Woman. I was like, okay, what is Wonder Woman? I just have to Google read, and then, but for the book, I still like myself as a conservative, and then I say, since I get this chance, what do you guys, from your experience, do you like as a parent and as a
I personally was not a huge fan, and I don't think Pamela was either, of the traditional franchise superheroes, and I wouldn't gravitate to those books. But there are a lot of authors who take the concepts of the superhero world and the ideas, and they make them into what I think are, you know, better stories that focus on things like cooperation and teamwork and compassion. I mean, Captain Underpants, for example, by Dave Cookie, is a wonderful book. I mean, yes, he's taking from a superhero motif, but check out, if your older child hasn't seen Captain Underpants yet, it is very much subverting a lot of what you find in the traditional superhero stories. Hero stories.
I just bought 2 books, and then I said I read it myself. That's what I do. Because since it's like the first time being a parent in this, I read it. I say, this is, even for me, it's too hard. I'm not gonna let him do it. I just kept it. You know,
But he'll find Captain Underpants, and he will love them. And even better, in my view, than Captain Underpants is Dogman, which comes after Captain Underpants. I see people are smiling just at the mention of Dogman. These are incredibly funny books with a really big heart that are really talking about growing as a person. And, you know, the theme of Dogman, you know, the bad guy in Dogman has to learn how to be a dad, you know.
Because
so
it's for everyone. That's what the reason why I just want to mention it is, like, I knew some parents, like kids like 3 or 4 year old, they have absolutely like
they've
Superman.
just gone, I would resist going full superhero as far as like those franchise ones. They're going to get that. They'll get plenty of exposure to that. But when you're choosing the books and you're steering them to books, there's so many other options that give them that same fix that they're looking for, like mythology. You know, mythology coming from other cultures. Now you can find that has a lot of this, like bravery and saving the world and big stakes. You know.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's a tension, right? Because on the one hand, we believe very strongly in letting your child follow his interests, right? No matter where they are. Like if they're interested in Fortnite, find books about Fortnite. There are books about Fortnite, or there are books around Minecraft. So on the one hand, if they're really into superheroes, and 2 of my kids were into superheroes, now they're all into superheroes. But when they were really little, I looked for the options, and what they were essentially at that time were leveled readers, right, that were branded, whether they were Marvel or DC. And the stories, frankly, like, weren't great. I did let my kids read them because, again, just going along the lines of, I want to indulge that, sort of let them go where they want to go, and support them. But I mean, what's interesting is that, like, I do think that most kids will realize they're not that great and they kind of lose interest relatively quickly. But I agree with Maria that if you think about the really good aspects of superhero culture, you think about heroism, teamwork, leadership, justice. There are ways to find those themes in myths and fairy tales and folk tales where you can be like, oh, who is the hero of this story, right? In this, like, Ghanaian folk tale, the hero is this animal, or, and so there are ways to kind of bring out those themes, if not the, exact character.
Yeah, I agree. Like, the idea, I'm not saying the idea is bad, but my worry is, like, do you think it's appropriate to export them as early as like 3-4 years old?
I mean, the nice thing about having a 3-year-old is you're in charge, really.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. For me,
you really get to make a lot of the reading choices at 3. Maybe at 5 they're starting to exert a little bit more of their own influence. So I would say hold on as long as you can to what you like. This is one of the great things about being a parent is that you're bringing these books in just like the rest of your child's world. You're the one who's establishing this family culture and what do we value in our house? What kind of stories make us laugh? And so you still have that power while they're this little. So I would use your power for good.
Yes. And one of the nice things too is when you do have that power is you can follow your kids' interests, but you also have to remember, and I would forget this sometimes, if your child is like, all I want to read about is the ocean. That might just be because that's something they heard about that day in school, so they're sort of interested in it. But they don't necessarily know when they're really young about the desert or about, Norse mythology or about, Frog and Toad. Like, they don't know everything that's out there. And so what I would always do is try to remember, like, my child doesn't actually know what he's interested in at this point. Like, he has a sort of selected idea, but I would bring home things that I didn't even know if he would like, and then it'd be, and sort of spread them out. And then he could he might discover things on his own. It's hard to remember that your child is learning about the world through books. So sometimes I used to say, well, I can't read this book to my kid because it's about an airport and he's never been on an airplane. So, like, it's unfamiliar. And then I would realize, well, wait, he can actually learn about somewhere where he's never been, and he can learn about it through the book.
I have a question about the difference between 2nd and 3rd grade. You say to let reading happen sort of naturally, and that it clicks at different times for girls and boys, and we sort of let them, as educators, we let it click when it clicks. Like, sometime between kindergarten and 2nd grade is usually normal. Mm-hmm. But there's research that says that by 3rd grade, if they're not on grade level, that they're behind. So if we're letting kids naturally, like, if it clicks at 2nd grade, there's very little time between 2nd and 3rd grade to where they're being evaluated and being behind. So for parents that have limited financial resources and limited personal time, a lot of our parents work multiple jobs. What is sort of the single most important thing you think that they can do in that year to help make sure that their child is not already behind within the next 12 months?
I mean, honestly, I go back to that very fundamental idea that it's the school's job to teach your child how to read. As the parent, you can, if you know that your child is behind, sort of reach out to the teacher, talk about, maybe seeing a reading specialist. But that fundamentally, what Maria and I try to emphasize is that if you want to raise a child who loves reading and that child is behind, that child probably knows that he's behind or that she's behind and feels bad about it. So reading is full of a lot of negativity and pressure and fear for that child. So as the parent in the home, what I would do in that situation, in addition to reaching out, making sure that the school's on it, that they know that they're aware and that they're doing what they need to do during the school day, I would make sure that I was keeping it really pressure-free and fun. Because otherwise that child's going to grow up like with reading having a very negative association. And so I would just, in the home, spend that time making sure that reading is a pleasure. And even if it's reading aloud to that child, when that child's supposed to be reading independently, you are creating a positive family experience. You're being supportive of books. You're showing that you value reading, and you're reading them a story. And let's say you're reading them something that they wouldn't be able to read on their own. Let's say you're reading them, Stuart Little or Charlotte's Web, and they can really enjoy hearing that. That's a positive experience around books. And I think that's, to me, that's the most powerful thing that a parent can do in the home.
That is so important, especially when the child is already starting to experience judgment and negativity around their reading. The parent can make sure that the parent is bringing in the fun and not more of a hammer when the kid gets home.
Because
and the other thing that we talk about is how people who read for pleasure actually do succeed in life, and so this is another thing that might sound counterintuitive, but if you can maybe just kind of back off of whatever those alarming statistics and all of that, and just remember that if your child chooses books and reads on his own at some point, that's a good sign for his future success. And so anything you can do that's helping your child to become a voluntary reader is actually helping him get better grades later in life.
I would say, especially for parents who are working a lot, who don't necessarily have, devoted child caregiver, that they're not watching their child every moment of the day. So a lot of the time during the day, that child is making choices about how to spend his time. And she might be deciding, hey, I have the iPad, I have a Wii, I have, these toys, and I have books, and I can make the choices of how to spend my leisure time. You want to make sure that they're choosing books. So if reading for them is something scary and something they have to do and something they know they're bad at, they're not going to reach for those books. So you're just compounding the problem over time. So I think that it's really important to, in whatever way you can, it can be audiobooks, it can be, hey, let's listen to a story in the car, or let's, put it on, you can listen to a story on an iPhone, at night, or we'll listen to a story in the living room all together every night in chapters. So that child is going to have the choices of how to spend her leisure time, and you just want to make sure that you're making books in some way, whether it's listening to an audiobook or being read aloud to, or being able to choose a book that's too easy, that it's fun, because otherwise your child will not choose to read. And if they don't choose to read, they don't build that habit, then that just compounds that original problem.
It's so true. And another thing I would emphasize for a child in second grade and first grade even, who you're not seeing the fluid reading that the teacher might be looking for, or that you think is appropriate for that age, that child could be a more visual reader. And what's so great about books right now is that there's been this explosion in graphic novels, heavily illustrated chapter books for just this age. And I would make sure that this child has access to the Dogmans, but there's so many more. There's the Raina Telgemeier books, the Smile and Drama, Telgemeier. She writes graphic novels that girls especially really love about her struggles. There's
Cece Bell, actually. This book is for kids that are a little bit older, but she has this great new, there's a lot of
this one here,
sort of
El Defo graphic.
So this is for older kids.
This is for older kids, but
she writes these books for first and second grade and kindergarten that are actually early readers but don't look like early readers.
Right, she has so many, and they're really, and find humor. Make the books funny and visual. So I would say for that second grade kid, maybe they're not, maybe Charlotte's Web isn't gonna do it, but that kid will love some of these amazing early readers and chapter books that are heavily illustrated. The Treehouse books, for example, the 13-story Treehouse, 26-story Treehouse. This is a different thing than Magic Treehouse, not Magic Treehouse. These are heavily illustrated. Wimpy Kid, Diary of a Wimpy Kid, Dork Diaries. These are the books that can help that child get over that hump into third grade. Don't expect every 8-year-old. I have a kid who just turned 9, could never read the big chunky middle grade supposedly 8 to 12 books still. But he loves his Wimpy Kids. He loves. He's just starting to read the more books like El Defo. But he really wants illustrations to support the the words.
Yeah.
And that's okay. That's all part of reading, right? We talk a lot about that. Visual reading, following a narrative in pictures is a big part of becoming a reader. And there's so many books that can help this child keep reading by focusing on the artwork.
I mean, another thing I would add to Maria's point is that there are so many different kinds of readers, and part of it is figuring out what kind of reader your child is. So for some kids, it might be graphic novels. For others, there are these great photography books that are like 101 wacky facts about animals that like National Geographic will do.
Right.
Like
Lots of
books
kids
that
like
are
facts.
that are photograph heavy, that are fun facts, that are things like Ripley's Believe It or Not, or books that are, you know, like aren't books that you would consider like a book to be read through. For a lot of kids, that's what they like. They want jokes, they want facts, they want photographs.
They
And I think we have to remember,
that's so
like, that's
interesting.
reading too.
You know, that's so interesting that you say that, because my son, who likes graphic novels, loves fact books too. So he just recently reorganized his shelves, and I was like really interested in his choices. Lots of all the Dogman, Wimpy Kid, but also the Book of Presidents.
Yes.
That he loves.
Yeah, you have a book over there. It's like 2,000.
Right, he loves those
awesome facts.
awesome
you know,
facts.
Like, those are
you know,
great.
the NBA 2018, the book. They make Scholastic and National Geographic do these great books. Just every year, compendiums,
The almanacs,
facts,
the Guinness
almanacs.
Books
He
of
loves
Records.
maps. He loves to look at a book of maps. So that's another thing that can really help some of these parents who are despairing because their 8-year-old boy isn't reading, the Newbery-winning novel. Well, give him an atlas. Give him the Book of Presidents. He might be a fact reader. He might be a visual reader. And we need to take away our own judgments of these kinds of books as not quite books.
I think that that's also a time where you really want to make sure that the books that your child is being exposed to are not just reflect their interests, but also maybe their experience, and that's where also I think diversity becomes very important. If your child is in a school that maybe doesn't have a great budget for a library, they might have those outdated books. Like it might be that your child just hasn't found the kind of books that speak to him. So I think that it also just might be about exposing them to a wider array.
Yeah, so it was a really interesting this morning. It was the audiobooks. That was one of my questions actually.
They're real books.
Yeah. My son, the one who's gonna be 5, he loves his book. Now he's like struggling to learn how to read by himself. He just like, Mommy, I need 10 books. He just put the 10 books. He just spent like half an hour turning, trying to say words. He knows his ABCs. And then I feel like he said, Mommy, how I can learn how to read by myself? I said, okay, you will learn through the time. He said, I can see the letters, but I can't read it. And I was like, okay, I'll find out the way. And then I went to the library. So for that 1,000 books signed up for like 3,000 books before kindergarten, you get into almost like 800 plus.
Wow.
So we're almost there, those books. And then I said, he will be 5, but he's not going to kindergarten this year because he's like our
His birthday?
down is like
Yeah.
September 17th. I was like, let me go to kindergarten section. So I went to kindergarten section in the library. The whole section was piled up with audiobook. And I was like, I'm not like starting from all my research as a American Pediatric Association doesn't like recommend any video or anything for less than 2 years. He never seen TV until he turned 2. Even now, for both of them, I just give them like Friday 1 hour, Saturday half an hour, Sunday half an hour. That's it. They don't watch any TV, nothing. But they read as much as book. Everywhere is a book. So
That's great.
Yeah.
and then I was like, oh, I picked that book. It's all audio book that's like it has a little USB device attached into it.
Oh,
And-
that's different from an audiobook.
Yeah,
So
this
that's
is
more
audio.
like, you mean books that have like buttons that you
Buttons
can
and
press?
yeah,
and...
press forward is option. And then I picked all of them, and then I got home, and my husband was like, no, this is not right for him. And then we were debating. I was
Yeah,
like,
we're not huge
I
fans
don't
of
think
those.
Yeah, I was like,
I don't think you need that extra bells and
said,
whistles.
He said, you know what? He loves this book. Just give him time. He said, can I do it? And the good thing, my kids, they listen. I said, you know what? Daddy doesn't agree. I had questions, like I wasn't happy when I picked it. I said,
let me read it for you. But they're still, okay, mommy, when you finish, can I press and listen to it? And I was like, you know what, this is the right time. I can mention it this question. So what you guys think, like, for the beginners, he's not struggling. I'm
Right.
not gonna say struggling. He's gonna be like 5.
Yeah.
He knows the letters. He can count under 100. He knows his addition, all of that. But do you think? And then I was like, why the librarian feel that all
Yeah,
this?
that might just, you can,
or you
don't
don't see
forget,
any book.
librarians
Like,
are there
it's
for you, so have a conversation with the librarian. You know, there might be a reason, that might be a temporary thing, but
I did.
librarians,
I'm a good, like, I ask, I don't pass. Like,
Yeah.
if I don't know anything, I don't care about, like, I asked the lady who worked there, and she said, we thought it's gonna help for all the kids, they start reading. So it's not, she said it's up to you to pick it up or
Yeah.
not. I was like,
I mean,
okay.
you know, we were hoping you were going to talk about audio, the more traditional kind of
No,
audiobooks,
no.
because that's a nice,
Yeah.
these books we would say, I'm sure Pamela would agree, it doesn't seem necessary. Your
Yeah.
kids love
I think a book doesn't need a
books.
battery.
They don't need an extra gizmo attached to the
For
book.
your information,
You
it's
know?
not one book, all of the book that was piped.
Yeah. I mean, maybe if it's a tool for learning the sounds and attaching them to letters, but that sounds like something that would be better done in a classroom. In your home, you want it to be about stories.
Yeah.
And I would say, like, kindergarten books, these books are kindergarten books too, you know? So
Yeah.
they might, if you're looking for books that are specifically to teach a child to read, there are books like the Bob books, for example, which are very, very simple.
Phonics,
small
you know,
books
attaching the sounds to.
right, that help you learn, you know, they'll be like one word, mat on a page, and then cat, and then mat sat on a cat, you know,
Yeah.
that kind of
I
thing.
have them. Yeah.
Okay, so you know. So but I think like having a button that you would press is not necessary.
And what
Yeah.
about the phonics CDs? Like,
No.
It just seems like, you know,
The
why not let the
school get to
school
that, yeah.
do that? You know, and you know, and
I mean, it's wonderful that your child is so motivated.
yeah, it
Right,
is.
it's
But
great.
I mean, and even you know, we should say right here that we even find it a little bit sad that kindergartens are so focused on teaching reading, because as we mentioned, not every child in kindergarten is ready to read, and there's so much instructional time on trying to get these little brains to attach the word to the sound, and some of those brains aren't ready to do that. And you know, I know what you're going to say, in Scandinavia and European countries, I'm like, I'll let you take this one away, because
Well, they don't
we
even
find
teach
this so
children
interesting.
until they're 7 or 8 or 9 to read. One of the interesting things too is, and I can't emphasize this enough, is that sometimes the later readers become the better readers, and it actually can be. I remember my daughter started reading in preschool. They had those Bob books, and so she could do that. Well, those books actually are kind of funny, but most books for that age that a child can read are like stultifyingly boring, because you know, think about the options that you have of 3-letter words that rhyme. So when your child is developmentally able to read at the age of 7 or 8 or 9, they're also ready for much more sophisticated, interesting stories, and it clicks much faster. You know, so if you wait until their brain is there, it
You can skip all
often
of the
be
boring
a more enriching
books.
experience. And of my 3 kids, the one who started reading the latest is my most sophisticated, voracious reader.
So
That's my
yeah.
little dated
So
set.
all of that, but that's another thing that we would really say to all parents, especially parents coming from backgrounds where they didn't read much as a child. They don't, you know, they're not sure. It's not important when your child learns to read, and you don't have to be the gatekeeper of their reading. You don't have to push them. You don't have to teach. It's not your job. You're not a teacher. It's not your job to teach reading. And somehow, so many parents have absorbed this as part of their job as parents.
Right. I mean, when you hear parent involvement, which is great, and being supporting your child in school, but it doesn't mean you actually have to teach.
You don't actually teach the reading.
Teachers.
What you teach is, this is a home where we value books. This is a home where we have lots of fun, beautiful books to read. And I read to you, and I'm reading my own books sometimes. Don't bother me because I'm busy reading. You know, that's how you teach your child to read, is you model what it looks like to be someone who, I'm just reading my mystery, and I have to find out what happens, so just leave me alone for the next 20 minutes.
So I feel like we only have 5 minutes left, roughly. Should we get to any burning questions that you might have that we want to be sure not to leave out?
what do you get, like, I don't know, just I'm gonna mention one question. Like, I know some kids, they used to be like a good readers, loving book, like from families,
Is this
like
the screen
parents.
question?
And
Yeah,
then
they
it drops
just, like,
off at a certain
They
age.
stop certain
Yeah, we hear this
age
a
and
lot.
it's like,
We
to
live
the
this.
point of the hating the book, I was like, it's frustrating me because I have a family member who did that, and then she cannot walk without her book until she gets to high school, like she can't, you know.
Right.
And then now she doesn't ever want to.
Well, I wish we had more than 5 minutes to deal with this, but
I
the
know.
first thing we would say is do not give up hope. Lots of kids go through different phases. Teenagers, as we all know, are developmentally going through a lot. They can sometimes drop the things they love doing because they're trying new things, or
Trying to figure out who they are.
they're figuring out their new identity as a teenager. So that really can happen. The main thing is to keep the enthusiasm high for books. Keep for finding the books that your teenager will like, or it could be your 10-year-old or 11-year-old. Don't be pessimistic about it. Don't assume that once they are taking a break from reading, they're never going to go back, because as Pamela was saying, it's a habit, right? If they have a habit of reading and it comes from early in their life, it's always going to be there for them. It's a gift they have for their whole life, even if maybe there's a year or two where it's not quite the first thing in there.
And here's one sign of hope, which is that studies show of kids, surveys, and their behavior reflects this, that kids prefer physical books to ebooks. Not just little kids, teenagers. And what kids, teenagers, and older kids will say is, I'm on my screens like all day, I need a break. Like when I want a story, I just want to dive into my book, right? And so that, I think, is a really good sign, that as much as your kid might seem to be on like Snapchat or Instagram or playing video games all day, kids need a break too, right? And so if you're showing them the benefits of a story through books, that's something that they will then seek refuge in.
Right,
as they
and
get older.
make sure they have the books too, physically, and the older kids, and make sure they're seeing you read, and and don't give up hope for your kids, because reading is something that
I know. I have a long way to go, but I'm
Yes,
just like
right.
trying to
You don't have to worry about the teenagers. You don't have to worry about the teenagers.
It's really true. Teenagers would rather have a physical book. It can become, even in a weird way, a status symbol when everyone else is looking at screens all the time, to be the kid walking around with a book.
A positive status.
Yes,
symbol?
yes.
Okay.
Did you have a final?
No, I mean we had pretty similar questions.
Yeah.
Some of them were pretty similar. But one of mine was about keeping interest with middle grade readers. I've never heard them call
Yeah.
that. So that
Well,
was
that's
Middle
actually an
school,
important
they're middle
point.
school kids, and then there are middle grade books. So it's a
no middle grade books.
Middle
Yeah,
grade
well,
books.
that's more like a publishing industry term, and
Yeah.
we both think it's not the greatest
Yeah.
term, because it does confuse people, and they think middle school.
right.
But
Middle
it
grade
really
books
is
are
8
like
to
8 to
12.
12.
Yeah, no, you do a good job of explaining what that is in the, because I immediately thought, oh great, I got to my middle schoolers. So there's not a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
By the time, and kids do like to read up, they like to read about characters a little bit older than themselves, so by the time they're in middle school, they really are probably looking at YA.
I mean, one of the things that I think a parent can do, and it again seems counterintuitive, but at a certain age, right, your kids might feel like they're done with kids' books, even if they're not really done. But they might decide momentarily, like, I don't want little kid books anymore. So you can take we included a list in here of sort of my first grown-up books. You can say, like, you know what, like, maybe I think this is a little
Really?
inappropriate, but maybe you might like this book that I read when I was 15, and that's very alluring, right? Because if you were reading that when you were 15 and you're giving it to your child who's only 12, so that shows that you think that they're really mature, maybe you can handle it. Sometimes they can't. Right. It is a lot about framing, and sometimes they can't, and sometimes they'll read things that are maybe a little bit inappropriate. But then again, like, wouldn't you rather have your child learn about that thing, whatever it might be, in the context of a book than sort of out there on the internet or unmediated?
Okay, well,
It's always better in a book.
All right, I guess we're out of time, but this was amazing. Thank you so much
Thank you
for
guys
having
so much.
us.
It's
Thank
such a
you.
great resource.